Hey everyone, I'm Darshan Senthil, and in this video I'm going to be talking to you about opening principles, basic opening principles. And this video is going to be really important because how you start is the most important thing in chess, like or in any game, for example, that's cricket, baseball, soccer, and even in chess. It doesn't really, this how you start is very important. If you let your opponent get the upper hand early on, you're going to struggle later on. So the opening is very important in chess, and in this video I'm just gonna give you some things to keep in mind when you open so you have a better opening. So yeah, let's get started. So two things you want, that you always want throughout the game, are when you are opening, that you through the opening and middle game, the two things that you always want to hold are king safety and center control. And by center control, it's mainly dominance over these four squares. If you've got dominance over these four squares, attack is going to be a lot easier, because if you notice here, if we were to place, say, a bishop on d5 and a knight on e5, then look at what radius this covers. The knight can go to c6, it can go to d7, it can go to f7 and to g6. And this bishop here can nail down f7 and b7. This is a these two pieces can do a lot of damage to black here if he's not careful. So that's why you want these pieces, that's why you want center control early on. If you can gain control of the center, then you're in really good shape. And similarly, you also want king safety. You want to get your king castled as soon as possible and hold for and keep him safe throughout the game until the end game, where it's safer to bring him out and use him to capture pawns and win pawn end games and stuff like that. So your king should stay castled, king or queen side, whichever is your preference. It's recommendable that you sort of castle king side mostly, because castling queen side has its risks because of the vulnerable a2 square. So those are the two things that you need to keep in mind. And your opening should always look to gain center control. Now, if you play a move like h3, it's not gonna be much good, because you know that because it doesn't gain you much control of the center. It's some random move over here, and you're giving black the momentum. So you want to play a strong move that attacks the center, like e4. What this does is it holds down this d5 square and also seizes the initiative up in the center. And it also frees room for white's development of his white squared bishop to c4, and that's another key thing. So assuming black can't play, and I'm just going to show you what an ideal opening for you should look like. You want to play upon d4, then bring out your knights to c3 and f3, bring your bishops out, I'm developing from the queen side here, and bring your queen to d2, and castle king side. Like I said before, sometimes it's recommended to castle king side because it's slightly stronger as opposed to if you castled queen side, because you've got that weak a2 pawn there. While your rook has got a more central file, that a2 pawn hangs, so you want to be a little bit careful. So unless you are experienced with castling queen side, it's recommended that you just go with king side. It's slightly safer. So yeah, this is what your ideal opening wants to look like, and notice that here all your pieces are really working together. Your pawns are holding down the important key squares, and your knights are also in a position to jump in and take them in. Your bishops are controlling these nice long diagonals, and your queen, although is slightly passive, is still playing a good defensive role. Remember, if you don't have to have an active queen early on in the game, you want to use your minor pieces up front and keep your queen passive for the and your major pieces passive, because it's easier for your opponent to attack them and gain tempo, and I will show you what that means later in this video. So you want to keep your queen slightly passive, but it's still doing a lot. You see, it's defending your bishop on f4, and it's also helping with this defense of this pawn on d4 as well. And notice that your rooks are interlinked, meaning that they not only control this e file stronger, but they're both free to move anywhere, like to e1 and take a nice long open file here. So this is what an ideal opening would look like here. Now I'm just going to tell you a few things that you want to keep in mind when you're opening, and I'll tell you that in just a second. Let's go. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is that it's better to develop your knights ahead of your bishops when you're developing your minor pieces. And that's just primarily because your knights can be placed a lot easier. Like for instance, if you play your knight to f3, then just a second. Yeah, so if you play your knight to f3, it's just going to be a lot easier because it controls more squares from just the third rank, so it's not as easy to chase around the board as opposed to, say, a bishop to c4. This can be chased around and it's not as effective from a square as, say, so if you simply play like d5, then the bishop goes to b3, it's no longer as effective because it controls only 2 squares now. So that's why it's easier to develop knights ahead of bishops. And also, a knight takes more moves to get to the other side of the board, so it's good to get a few moves of the knight in early on so it can get to the other side of the board quickly. So that's just a few reasons why knights are developed ahead of bishops. It's not a very important rule because there are a lot of openings that just involve like e4, e5 and bishop c4. So it doesn't really matter. It's not the end of the world if you open with your bishop ahead of your knight, but it's just a little tactical thing to keep in mind that it might be slightly better to open with your knights. And like I said again, don't stress about it too much. It's not the end of the world if you play your bishop to c4 before your knight to f3. So that's just one of the things to keep in mind. Another thing you want to keep in mind is that you want to move all your pieces no more than they have to be moved when you open up, because you want to develop as many pieces as you can in the opening in as few moves as possible, so you gain control of the center as quickly as possible. So you do not want to move a piece more times than necessary. So for instance, if you play your pawn to e4 and black plays e6, then you do not want to play e5 because that's unnecessary, because you're moving that more than you have to. You just want to move, like, you want to bring on another piece like knight f3. Then if he plays like d5, then maybe you can capture because it's an attack. Then you can capture based on what calculations you have after that. But it's good not to move a piece more than you have to, because that gives your opponent tempo, and I will just show you how that can really affect you in the next thing that I'm going to talk about right here. So the next thing you want to keep in mind when you're playing is that you don't want to bring out your major pieces early on. And the reason this is because your opponent can simply keep bombarding them with attacks and you lose momentum as you keep trying to save that piece, because you can't just afford to exchange it off with something of less value. So you're gonna lose a lot of tempo in the opening, which is never a good thing. So, and that also contradicts the rule that we just discussed, which is that you should never move a piece more than once. And let me just show you how bad this can really hurt you. Now for instance, if you play like e4, d5, ed5, queen d5. Now you see black's already got his queen out into the game. Now we can just play a move like knight f3, developing one of our pieces and attacking this queen at the same time. So black cannot just bring more development, but he has to save his queen now. So let's just say he plays a move like queen d4. I'm not saying he will do this, but assuming he does. Then we can bring our knight to other knight out to f3. So he's got to move again. So he cannot come here or here because of our knights. So he's got to go to some place like f4, assuming he goes there. Then now we can bring our pawn out to d4. And notice he cannot capture our pawn because of our knight. And we've also got this discovered attack on him through this bishop here on c1. So then he's got to move somewhere like f5. Then we can bring our bishop to d3 with put another attacker on him. Then if he moves his queen to f6, again further retreating, we're gonna bring our bishop to g5. And now let's say if he moves his queen to say d6, we're just simply gonna castle, and we've pretty much finished our development. We've got strong center control and we've developed about all our minor pieces, and black's developed nothing. He's gonna spend the next couple of moves sort of trying to get some sort of development on with his bishops, and by that time we'll be able to bring our queen out to d2 and bring our rook, gain control of this file and whatnot. We'll have a great game from now as white. So that's a key thing to keep in mind. Do not move a piece more than once, and do not bring your major pieces out early on, because they're going to be chased around and you're going to lose momentum. And this also shows why you should not move a piece more than once in the opening, because you're going to let your opponent get a stronger hold over the center. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. The last thing I'll be talking about in this video that you should keep in mind is that once you get king safety, you should keep it. You'd like, for instance, if you've got your king here castled on the king side, you don't want to play a move like g4 that exposes, like g4 that exposes your king up here, because if you do that, then it's easy for a piece to sneak around like this and get a clear shot at your king, and that's not something that you want. You want to keep the king safety as long as throughout the opening and the middle game, because it's not safe to bring out your king until there are few pieces on the board. You want to keep him safe behind this wall of pawns, and you don't want to move anything unless you really have to. So you don't want to move these. Another thing that you want to do on the king side is you should try and play this pawn to h3 like this. Now this does many things. One, it prevents black from bringing his bishop to g4 with that pin on the queen that usually happens. And secondly, it also gives your king some breathing space here. Like, you may have heard of back rank mate, which is very common, particularly amongst intermediate and beginner players. It's when the rook sort of occupies this line here and the king is kind of stuck behind these three pawns, and a rook or queen comes to this 1st or 8th rank and the king cannot escape because he's stuck behind these three pawns. So moving this also gives him some breathing space, but you want to do this only after you've given your rook a nice long file, when you've sort of developed your rook, because it's not uncommon to sometimes, let me just get these out of the way, it's not uncommon to try to bring your rook pawn to f4 to bring your rook out, and if you've already moved your pawn to h3 and then you bring f4, then this g3 square is going to become very weak. So you always want to make sure that you've got your rook developed and maybe on e1 before you play h3. Otherwise you are actually better off just playing like f4. That way you've still got your breathing space over here. So you just want to be careful. That's one thing to keep in mind. And yep, that's the end of this video, and I thank you for watching, and please do subscribe and leave a comment, and yep, that's it. See you guys.